Okay, and then we're going to share screen. All right. So today, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about organic versus non-organic food and why it really matters. And I mean, I guess to take a step back, the reason why I wanted to start doing these presentations at least monthly for not only the staff, but all the members, all of you members out there, is because there's more to just health and wellness than exercise and eating right. And there's some of these hidden factors that can either be helping or actually sabotaging you and you don't even know it. So I wanted to start just bringing different lectures and different tidbits to you at least monthly to help kind of give you something to chew on and maybe even give you an opportunity to ask questions. This is being recorded. So if you're listening to the recording and you want to ask questions, I'll send out my information so you can get a hold of me via email as well if you have any questions, or just come find me in the club. So I just kind of wanted to put a question out there for anybody who's listening now, or for anybody who's listening to the recording later, is, do you shop organic, and why or why not? So if anybody who is listening wants to chime in, you can go for it. If not, we'll kind of move on from here. So I just wanted to start off with a picture, and what I want you to notice here is that there's really no difference in the picture, but one of these pictures could be fresh, ripe, just picked from really healthy soil, full of nutrient food, and it could be awesome for your metabolism, for your body. And the exact same picture could be produce that was picked 2 weeks ago, sprayed with pesticides and herbicides and glyphosate, and it could be super low in nutrients because it was picked 2 weeks ago, and it could wreak havoc on your health. And that, in a nutshell, is why health and wellness is so hard sometimes, because we don't really even know what we're getting and what we're eating is if it's even good for us. So that's just some thoughts to chew on as we kind of get rolling here. So kind of an outline for today. We're going to do a brief overview of the current food system because it's important to understand the food system in order kind of how we got here, why we even have to talk about organic versus non-organic food. And then we're going to get into what's actually in our food. And I use food in quotes because, as I'll talk about later, a lot of the things that we shop for in the grocery store they're edible, but they're not really food. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then what are the implications of these ingredients and barriers to fixing these issues, because it's definitely not an easy fix. It's not a simple problem. And then some recommendations, and we'll go over any questions anybody has at the end, and some recommendations for sure. So the current state of our food system, and I on this slide just kind of bringing up some big button issues here, and we'll kind of go more in depth into them on the next slides. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about subsidies and why the government subsidizes food, and why they basically subsidize all the foods that are not very nutritious for us. Then we're going to talk about big food, big pharma, and government, and how all of these big corporations are in it together to basically make money. The lobbyists that work for these big food and big pharmacy companies in government, marketing, monocropping, which is basically destroying our soil and turning it more into dirt because of these subsidies. These subsidies basically, and you'll find out in later slides, that it's mostly corn, wheat, soy, and maybe dairy. Kind of some of the most inflammatory foods we can eat, and that's what we subsidize the most. Global warming and how this monocropping and the way our agriculture works is actually causing global warming. Natural disasters, what happens when we monocrop and our soil turns to dirt and it can't absorb water, everything from landslides to other things. We'll talk about those. And then finally, the poor working conditions that not only the people that grow this for food work in, but also the food system in general, people who work at fast food or restaurants, and how these people, they can't even afford the food that they produce. So first picture, I think, says 1,000 words here. You on the top left have the choose my plate, what the government recommends that you should eat. And you can see that half of the plate is fruits and vegetables, right? And then in the bottom big infographic, you can see the money that the government spends on subsidies. So it's mostly grains and inflammatory dairy and protein, which makes up the smallest portion of the plate. So there's a massive disconnect on what the government spends their money on and what they're telling you is important to eat. So that's the biggest takeaway from that. The next infographic here also says 1,000 words, and this is going more into how big food and big government kind of control everything. So you can see that basically 6, maybe call it 8 companies produce 90-ish% of the food you see in the grocery store. And that gives them massive sway into the different laws put into place and the different recommendations that are made for health and wellness. I mean, a lot of these companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, they actually give money to universities for health research, and they fund registered dietitian programs. And then we wonder why some of the recommendations that they make don't actually kind of correlate with wellness. Next here, we have kind of the truth about food marketing. And this is specifically, this infographic is geared towards children. And again, the government says that fruits and vegetables are important, but when you look at marketing, less than 1% of money spent is aimed at fruits and vegetables. And I mean, just look at those bottom two. Fast food and sugary drinks, cereals and sweet snacks make up 91% of the money that is spent on convincing our children to eat those things. And it's sad because most of these things they pay money also to have these foods at eye level in the grocery store so that kids see them and want them and beg their parents for them. So the problems are multifaceted and they run really deep. This is talking about the environment and global warming. I think a lot of times we hear the narrative that agriculture and specifically cows and meat industry is the greenhouse gases are contributing to global warming. But as you can see on this infographic here, it's really only 10%. Meanwhile, the big companies that are putting out emissions like Coca-Cola and Nestle in their factories, those make up 22%. You could argue even more because they use electricity and they transport said products into our grocery stores. So, they're trying to put the blame on, meat that could be quality and very good for you. But in reality, the picture looks a lot different. And that's just kind of the point I wanted to make with that slide there. Then we mentioned natural disasters. So when these subsidized crops are raised over and over and over again, corn, soy, and wheat on the land, it depletes the land of its nutrients. And spraying all the pesticides and herbicides kill all the natural bugs and worms that make dirt actually alive or soil alive. Soil is a living organism. And what happens is soil can absorb hundreds of times of its weight in water. And that only helps during droughts, but it also keeps landslides and floods from happening when we get a lot of rain. So we get loss of crops, floods, and lots of mudslides when our soil turns into basically dirt from all this monocropping. And that's only the tip of the iceberg with the problems. So next, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the food industry and working conditions. I mean, a lot of the people that produce these foods, they're illegal labor from different countries. They work in poor working conditions. They spray chemicals and herbicides and deal with antibiotics and hormones with the animals. And this has been linked to early cancer death in a lot of these people. And not only that, the people that live around them. There's been many studies that show people who raise hogs in North Carolina, all the runoff of the antibiotics and hormones into the water system has caused cancer and other issues in people who live in the area. So it's not just the people working on the farms and in labor, it's the people that are around them, exposure to all those chemicals. Lack of rights. I mean, a lot of them work through, long 12-hour days doing the same repetitive job over and over again without getting breaks. I was watching one documentary about, I believe it was chicken or cow processing, where the people on the line have to wear diapers because they're not allowed to take bathroom breaks. So they have to just basically urinate themselves. And that's just, again, only one example. And then finally, people who work for these companies producing these foods, they can't even afford the food that they sell or produce in restaurants, people who work on the farms, in the fields. And I mean, that's another issue. And again, doesn't have a super easy fix. So all that is to kind of lead into, what is really in our food, kind of that organic versus non-organic debate. Food versus edible. So companies hire food chemists to engineer food to make it taste good. They literally are trying to hook you on their products. And that's why I say food versus edible, because these foods are actually engineered and they're marketed to you to get you hooked on them, especially kids. So it's a lose-lose situation. So edible food versus food. Pesticides and herbicides are sprayed all over our crops in order to kill pests, not only during the growth process, but even after wheat and things are harvested and stored in silos, they're sprayed again with glyphosate. You probably heard of, is basically Roundup, and then we ingest that in our products. Now, we wouldn't necessarily need these fertilizers and things if we actually had proper agricultural processes where we have animals and plants and crop rotation. And we won't get into what real agricultural processes or ancestral agricultural processes should look like. But just know that when done right, you don't need pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and things. Things can grow naturally, and it helps keep the soil alive and keeps the nutrients in our foods. Antibiotics and hormones, these are more so in your meat and dairy products. So one example of these is when cows are fed corn. That's not their natural diet, it's grass. And because these cows are fed corn to make them fat quicker, they get really sick. So they're fed corn, given hormones, both corn hormones makes them bigger faster, then they get sick, and then they have to be given antibiotics, and they slaughter them. So you're basically eating meat that is from sick animals that have been pumped full of hormones and antibiotics, and then we ingest it. I know it's kind of gross to think about, but that's what actually happens. And that's why, kind of leading into points later on, it's so important to try and shop organic when you can. Glues, colors and dyes, stabilizers, these are found in a lot of our preserved foods. Glues are in things like cheeses and things to keep them together. There's anti-clumping agents and things like Parmesan cheese to keep it from clumping. Dyes and colors to make things look a certain way, like cheese, or even like red meat. It's colored red because that's what we think it should look like, when in reality, anybody who's butchered an animal and eaten quality venison or beef knows that it's not a bright red. Stabilizers, natural flavorings. Natural flavorings is a tricky one. You see that on a lot of health foods. Basically, natural flavorings is like a blanket term for basically whatever we want to put in there. So there's like an example of RX bars, I think they're called. They tout that they only have like 4 ingredients. I think it's like eggs, dates, something and other. And it's just one example. But then if you look at the actual ingredient label, it says natural flavoring. So, these companies, again, not to kind of jump around, but it's all interrelated. They will basically trick you into eating what you think is a health food, but it's just a snack food repackaged as a health food. They take advantage of your willingness to snack because they told you need to. And instead of eating a Snickers, you're eating an RX bar, which you think is good, but it's really just a glorified Snickers bar. Genetically modified organisms. They basically change crops' DNA to make them yield more crops and to make them more resistant to pesticides and herbicides that they're spraying all over them. So you're basically eating genetically modified food. And that's why you see a lot of products that say nut and GMO. That's kind of a big thing now. But you have to watch out which company's actually certifying them, because you don't know if you can even trust those companies either. And we'll get to that more later on when we're talking about organic and how to shop. And then finally, hydrogenated seed oils, like canola and trans fats, those all kind of fall into this area. And they basically heat and process oils to the point of being like almost carcinogenic, which means they can cause cancer. And these are found in almost all packaged foods throughout your grocery store, that have tons of corn and wheat in there too. So you basically get like a inflammatory concoction that you're taking in when you eat those products. Moving on, now we'll talk a little bit about labels. So when we're actually shopping. So in the United States, we allow thousands and thousands of more chemicals and additives than they do in many other countries. And they use what's called generally recognized as safe, which basically means in a nutshell that they can use anything they want until it's proven to cause issues. So until there's tons of people getting sick or dying and it's causally linked back, and again, they can cash out by spending money and lobbying, but those things can still be put in your food. Deceptive names. So I'm sure people have seen on labels honey or agave nectar or different words for sugar. But long story short, all that really means is sugar. It just makes you more apt to eat it because it seems like it's healthy. And that kind of rolls into the deceptive order of ingredients. So an example I like to use for this is when you're looking at, let's say, a jam or a preserve. So you want strawberries to be the first ingredient because that means it's in the highest concentration. So what companies will do is they'll say strawberries, agave nectar, honey, and sugar, and they'll split sugar into 3 different terms so that they can list them later in the order. When in reality, if they just list what it was really in there, it would be sugar and strawberries. So again, you have to really watch out when you're shopping for things, because they're deceiving you left and right into buying their products and thinking that they're healthy for you. And then finally, deceptive requirements and portion sizes. So a lot of times when you're looking at food labels, and you look at the percentage of protein and things like that, and they're set for your average person, and not almost nobody's average. So you are having a hard time understanding how much you should really be eating. And another example is like portion sizes. Like how many times have you gotten a package of chips or Oreos and it says serving size 2 Oreos or 1.5 Oreos, and it says serving size like 8 chips. It's like, who actually sits down and eats 1 Oreo or 3 chips? No, nobody does. So that's again how you're kind of being deceived into eating what you think is maybe healthy for you, has less calories, and it really doesn't. So what are the implications of this? Like, why does this matter? You have to remember who funds the studies and the research that comes out that we listen to about our what we eat and what's healthy. It's these big companies, Nestle, Pepsi, Coca-Cola. They're the ones funding the research. So they're gonna have them find, quote unquote, results and conclusions that fit their narrative. So there's tons of misleading statistics on things, and there's no long-term studies with lower doses of these antibiotics, hormones, and chemicals that get into our body. They might say that they're bad in massive quantities, but they'll say, oh, but in the low amounts that they're found in foods, that they haven't been linked to cause harm. So what do these chemicals do in the body, these antibiotics and hormones and mimetics? Well, antibiotics not only kill and help, antibiotics given to the animals help them to live long enough to be killed. But in our body, they kill all our good and bad bacteria. So people may have heard about how antibiotics can kind of wreck your gut and cause leaky gut. Well, people will think, oh, I haven't been on antibiotics in 5 to 10 years. I should be fine. But in reality, they're taking in antibiotics every day in all their dairy and all their meat products. And that's why it's causing leaky gut, which then you can't even absorb nutrients, because that's where you absorb your nutrients, in your gut, and it causes more inflammation. And it's just this cascading of issues. And this all links back to, we could be thinking we're doing everything right. We're working out, we're eating healthy. But if our hormones are out of whack from all these antibiotics and artificial hormones in our body, then we can do everything we want right, and we're still not going to see the results we want to see. And then hormone mimetics. So a lot of these different plastics and things that are found, pesticides, herbicides in our food, they mimic hormones. They mimic estrogen specifically, which causes the body to store more body fat. Especially in men, you'll see gynecomastia, which is like more fat stored around the chest and the gut. And it just throws your hormones out of whack and causes you to store more body fat and causes more inflammation. And then finally, getting rid of toxins. So we accumulate all these toxins in our body from our food, from all the herbicides, pesticides, hormones. Again, the list goes on and on, right? Well, if we're not sweating, which is our skin, it helps us detoxify, drinking clean water, and that's a whole nother topic. All the same things we're talking about in food are all found in our water system, including plastics. And we're not fasting, which is another way our body gets rid of toxins, then we're never giving our body a chance to cleanse itself of all these things. I mean, think of the last year with COVID, how many people maybe haven't sweat in over a year, or we've been drinking, city water our whole life and never had a filter on it. So we're getting hormones, antibiotics, plastics all in our water too, and have never gone maybe more than 6 to 8 hours without eating. Again, those are big implications for having your body overwhelmed with these toxins that it can't deal with. So what are some of the barriers to change? We talked a little bit about these: big food, big government, and big pharma. I mean, all three of these work together to make more money. At the end of the day, it's about money. And we've talked about it a little bit indirectly about how does big pharma relate to this? Well, I don't know the exact number, but it's large. I think it's more than 50% of pharmaceuticals are actually sold to agriculture, again, to use for cows and other livestock to keep them, healthy enough, quote unquote, to slaughter to then to be eaten. So big pharma has a large stake in keeping the food system the way it is. So that's kind of how they're linked in there. And it's hard to fight against those three powers that are so big. Perceived costs. And I say perceived because, eating organic is expensive. But when you think about the nutritional value you're getting from, let's say, an organic apple versus an inorganic apple, it's actually, you get like 10 times more of the nutritional value, even for double the cost. So it's going to satisfy you or satiate you longer. You're going to have more energy, and you'll be able to go longer without eating. So even though you're spending more money, you'll actually be way more satisfied and way healthier, and you'll spend less on your health in the long term. And again, I'm not saying everybody can afford organic everything, and we'll talk a little bit more about what the priorities are later, but just understand that it is kind of a perceived cost thing, and it is going to make you healthier over the long term. Another example I like to use there too is even when you pick produce, every hour, minute, day that goes by after you pick this produce, it loses its nutrient density, even if it is organic. So if you're buying something that's been sitting in the store for 2 months, it's practically dead and void of nutrients at that point. And that is going to lead into some recommendations later on of like shopping farmers markets when you can. Hard in Minnesota, I know, but that's where you're going to get the most nutrient dense food and things like that. Availability, food deserts, this is a big one. When you go downtown, you go into small town USA, and all they have is the corner gas station. This is a big issue, and there's no really easy answer to that, except for that we need to get back to smaller farms, regenerative farms that are taking care of the soil, letting nature, live the way it's intended to live. That's the only way we're going to get back to healthy, nutritious food available for everybody. But again, fighting big food, government, pharma is going to be the hard thing to do there. Habits and addictions. We talked a lot earlier about how they use our habits against us, and they addict us to these foods as they engineer them to taste good. They make them salty, fatty, and sweet, which is the trifecta. And that's what gets us hooked. And then it creates those habits. And then again, they trick us with making snack food, health foods think that they're good for us, and the cycle continues. Like I just mentioned, engineered to taste good, and misinformation creating doubt. So as long as there's some misinformation out there casting doubt, it's like, well, does cholesterol cause heart disease or doesn't? Or does salt bad or good for you? As long as there's doubt out there, which there always is, people will continue to consume and eat these bad foods because they're always casting doubt. And not to stretch the comparison too far, but that's what happened with the cigarette industry back 20, 30 years ago, is all these big companies had to keep doing was just cast doubt that the cigarettes caused cancer. And they said, well, it's linked, but it doesn't actually cause it. And that was enough for people to just continue with their habits because there wasn't a strong enough link there for people to change. And that's what they're counting on. So looking at recommendations here. So what can we do? What can we do to eat a little bit healthier, help our family eat a little bit healthier? Well, first is support your local and regenerative farms. And by regenerative farms, I mean these are farms out there that are letting livestock and animals roam on their land. The livestock urinates, and their poop provides the nitrogen for the land to provide the energy for the soil instead of the fertilizers. It builds up the topsoil, creating more nutrients for the food that is grown on there, and it keeps more carbon dioxide in the environment and lack of carbon dioxide getting into the atmosphere. So not only is it giving us better food, keeping our land safer by preventing natural disasters, and it's keeping our atmosphere safe by keeping the CO2 in. So long story short, really want to look for regenerative farms because they're one of the big answers to all the problems that we're having. Vote with your dollar, support local, support regenerative farms. And I'll show you where to find those towards the end here. And secondly, start with your meat for organic. The reason why is that toxins and chemicals concentrate when they go up the food chain. So these bigger animals that are eating, for example, a cow that eats the non-GMO corn, all those things that are in the corn get concentrated in the cow, and then the stuff the cow is injected with gets concentrated into that animal. So start with your meat because there's way more toxins and chemicals in that than there is your fruits and vegetables and things like that. And then one caveat to that is if you can't afford organic meat, definitely eat lean meat because toxins are stored in animals' fat. Even in humans, your toxins are stored in your fat deposits. So if you can't afford organic meat, definitely eat leaner meat. If you can afford organic meat, get the fatty stuff. It's great for you. Healthy fat is very good for you. So if you can afford organic, definitely don't skimp on the fatty cuts. Clean up your water. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, water has all these chemicals in concentration because it all runs off this dirt that doesn't absorb the water. All these fertilizers, hormones, antibiotics, pesticides, herbicides, they all run into our water. So the best thing I can recommend is getting what's called an reverse osmosis water filter. And all that means is it basically filters literally everything out of your water. Now, because of that, you need to add back minerals, and you do that with like sea salts. So like a Himalayan sea salt or a Celtic sea salt, you want to make sure you're adding back some salt because you do need the minerals that are in water. But that's a huge one. I would start there, honestly, with anything with the water and then go to the meat. We mentioned a little bit already on changing the mindset around cost. And again, I want to be really sensitive to everybody's budgets, and I know it's a thing, but just know that if you start making some of these changes, you'll be fuller longer, so you'll eat less, you'll be getting more nutritional value, you'll stay out of the doctors more, you'll have more energy to work harder. Like all those indirect benefits will help offset the cost a little bit. So where do you find some of these sources for eggs, for meat, for dairy even? Use eatwild.com. If you go to eatwild.com, you can click on our state, Minnesota, or any state, and literally find a list of all these companies that are vetted. And then you'll know where in your local area you can go get poultry, eggs, pork, beef, and it's mostly those things, not as much grains and things like that, but you'll know where you can go find all those things. And then finally, we talked a little bit earlier about labels, but if you're shopping in the grocery store, the best you can do in a traditional grocery store to know that you're getting at least a decent food is finding the USDA organic label and the non-GMO certified label on the same product. Then you can be, generally safe on eating that product. Now, again, money and government is all tied into those things too. So you don't really know like what things do they allow to be sprayed on things and what things don't they. But these are the two biggest organizations, and two most reputable. So if you see other random things on labels that make it seem like it's organic or non-GMO, I wouldn't trust those at all. Most companies can just pay a dollar amount to get that label slapped on their product to make it seem like it's good for you. For example, like, eggs will say, free range, when in reality, they only have to be able to have like a foot of space, and they're still kind of with chickens in their own poop in the same little coop. And they'll say vegetarian fed, even though eggs or chickens are supposed to eat insects and things, not vegetarian feed. So again, the deception and things there. But the biggest thing to take away from that is look for those two things on the same label if you're in the grocery store shopping and not at your local farmer's market or shopping through like eatwild.com. And so these are some of the sources I used to put this presentation together. And if you're really looking for some more information, a book I really recommend is Food Fix by Dr. Mark Hyman. I think there's a typo there. It should be Mark, not Hark. And there's also a new book that I just started actually that's called Hooked, and it's how big food gets us hooked and addicted to those foods. So I would look up that one too if you're really interested in finding out more about some of these topics. Again, I know most people are listening on the recording, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, find me in the club, or email me at Mario, CUTINO @LT.life, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thanks everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Mario.